Jordan Addison, you sexy beast. Welcome back, everyone, to another video. Today we're going to be talking about, today's another episode of WWD. We're going to be talking about the Vikings 49ers game that happened. I'm not going to lie, it was kind of a dog shit game of football, but there was a few things that were pretty interesting that happened, as you saw by the intro, and Jordan Addison decided to light up the world. But either way, let's get right into things. We'll start out with Karen's husband. Karen's husband had Alex Madison, who didn't really do too much, to be honest. I didn't really expect him to do too much because he was playing against the 49ers, who have a very tough run defense. Um, he did have 8 carries for 39 yards, which actually isn't horrible. That's actually I would say it's actually a good night for him in terms of real life. In fantasy, he really didn't do too much. He did have 2 catches for only 3 yards, but in terms of fantasy, it wasn't a great night. In real life, he did a bit better in terms of the yards per carry than I was expecting. But other than that, there isn't really too much to mention. Cam Akers went out there and took about half the workload from him, too. So things aren't looking fantastic if you're a Jordan Addison owner. He is starting to go out there and lose touches. This is kind of the prime position for him to get fantasy points, too, with Justin Jefferson being gone. But the return of Justin Jefferson, I'm not going to say that Alex Madison's going to be looking like a very viable option, especially in the late season, though. I guess time can only tell, though. Maybe he's able to outplay Cam Akers and earn more starting reps, but so far it's not heading in the right direction, that's for sure, though. Next up, Karen also had a Caleb Evans. I'm still convinced Karen's husband took him just because it has the name Caleb and Evan in it. But either way, Caleb Evans had 8 points, so he had an okay night. Not a bad night, not a great night. He had 4 tackles, which is okay. It's hard to really come up with a take out of this just because he did okay, he didn't do great, he didn't do bad. He was just kind of there. He made a few tackles. That's pretty much all he did. There's one problem with the Caleb Evans I have, and that's that there's just so many other people on that defense that are going to get more tackles than him most likely and take the majority of the tackles. You have Cameron Bynum, we'll talk about when it comes to dictatorship. We have Jordan Hicks, who I think Toxic has. We have Josh Metellus, who Pussy has. There's just so many good tacklers. Oh, that's not even counting Harrison Smith that Mr. Steeler Girl has. There's so many good tacklers on this Vikings defense that I just don't think a Caleb Evans is ever going to have like insane upside unless he, gets a pick or something like that. I don't think you're going to see any more of those 21-point weeks. You might be occasionally lucky to get like a 15-point week, but either way, he's not a bad option, but he's not really a great option going forward at least. Then we'll go ahead and look at Toxic Zenpai and Justin Likes Kids. Toxic had George Kittle, who went out there and had a pretty solid night. He won a few points over projection. He had a rushing attempt for 2 yards. That was pretty humorous, but the main reason he had points was the 5 catches for 78 yards. He had some good catches, some good yards. Overall, a solid night, a touchdown away from a great night. So that overall, if you're Toxic, that's a step in the right direction. I'm still fearing his consistency factor because, it's not looking good. It's looking like anytime Kittle might have someone else on the offense out, say Deebo Samuel, say Brandon Ayuk, maybe Christian McCaffrey. Anytime someone else on the offense is out, maybe he's a good start in fantasy. But outside of those weeks where people have been hurt, he's had one good week out of like 5 where everyone was healthy and he actually did good. And that was the week against Dallas. But other than that one week, it's just not looking consistent, and I'm not liking him as a tight end option for the rest of the season. But at least while Deebo Samuel's out, he's looking pretty good. And then Toxic also had Jordan Hicks, who did have a bit of a he had a solid night. He didn't do bad again. He's just kind of projected pretty high, so he fell a little off his projections. But overall, you're not going to complain. It is a good 13 points, 8 total tackles. That's just him getting a little bit off of getting, 8 total tackles, so that would have been 16 points. So overall, he's still getting in the range. He just got unfortunate with some tackle assists. I think he'll go back to doing really, really good in the upcoming weeks. No concern here. I really like Jordan Hicks as an option overall. It was just a little bit low compared to how good he usually does, but nothing to be concerned over. Then we'll go and talk about Justin Lake's kids who had Brandon Ayuk. Brandon Ayuk was pretty much the wide receiver one tonight since Deebo Samuel was gone. And in turn, the Vikings pretty much scripted their game plan around stopping him. Because the thing is, you would think in 9 times out of 10 they would game script around stopping McCaffrey in this situation. The problem is they didn't know if McCaffrey was going to play, so that's why they were pretty much trying to stop Ayuk for most of the game. But even with that being said, Ayuk was able to scrap up 5 catches for 57 yards and have a solid night out of it, especially if Deebo Samuel were to miss, say, the next week or something like that. I think Brandon Ayuk will have a way better week than that, but for what it's worth, he did still do solid. Just not as high as his projection was saying. You also had San Francisco's defense. This is where things got a little bit disappointing. They did give up 22 points to a team missing their number one offensive player. And I believe their left tackle was still out. I'd have to do some research to confirm that. But either way, yeah, they did give up 22 points, which isn't a crazy amount of points. It's still solid overall, but you would hope for a little bit less when we're playing a team as crippled as the Vikings right now. They did have an interception, but other than that, they really didn't get to the quarterback too much. They didn't have too many they had a few tackles for loss, but they really didn't get to Kirk Cousins at all. You would hope for more out of Nick Bosa, out of Javon Hargrave, out of all these guys and how good that defense should be. It just didn't happen. They couldn't really make the big plays they usually do. But overall, you can say that the 22 points could be excused by the fact that the Niners offense kept causing turnovers, especially Brock Purdy. But either way, then it's definitely a disappointment for the Niners team defense no matter what. It is starting to look concerning with how bad the offense is looking for San Fran. Maybe the return of, Deebo Samuel, Christian McCaffrey, and all that actually can help them, but it is kind of scary how much this team has flipped since winning 42-10 against Dallas, who was one of the best defenses in the league. So I guess we'll have to wait and see. These past 2 weeks have definitely been questionable to say the least, though. And that's kind of hurting everyone on the Niners offense and defense, except for George Kittle. Next up, we'll go ahead and take a look at. Actually, no. Before we do that, Justin Lake's kids also had Dre Greenlaw, who had 21 points. Another very, very good week out of him. A total of 10 tackles. He also had a tackle for loss as well. Fantastic night. He's been doing this all season where he just does really, really good. He had a few off weeks, and then he's been dealing with injuries on a few weeks. So overall, he's been doing really good, though. He's been looking like one of the better options in fantasy. His only issue is a little bit on the consistency side. You'd hope for a bit more. But other than that, he's looking very good. I would definitely say I'd recommend starting him over some of your other options in the upcoming weeks if I'm Justin Lake's kids, that's for sure. Next up, we'll take a look at Scrambled and Wiggle Waggled, who just got fucking annihilated. Scrambled and Wiggle Waggled had KJ Osborne, who was one of my recommendations in a past video. Now, he's not like an elite player or anything, he is going to be a wide receiver too for the Vikings at the end of the day, but like I said, he is going to be a consistent option, at least while Justin Jefferson's gone. He might have occasional upside, but at least he's doing what I kind of expected, where he's going out there and he's getting targets, he's getting a few catches, he's getting some solid yards. Any given week, a touchdown could make his okay week a great week. And this was one of the harder matchups he's probably going to have for the rest of the season. Well, maybe not the rest of the season, at least until Justin Jefferson comes back, if he does come back. But other than that, yeah, KJ Osborne is definitely doing okay. That's pretty much the best way I can describe it. He's doing what I expected. He's not really going to be flashy, but for what it's worth, he was a solid free agent. Then you had Greg Joseph, who finally had a glass of wake the fuck up in terms of fantasy. Yeah, he well, in terms of fantasy at least, not really in real life, but in fantasy he did have the 2 field goals. Well, actually 3. I forgot about the 50-yarder, but he also missed an extra point too, so he did play like shit in real life. That's why I said that, but either way, he at least is getting points in fantasy for these past 3 weeks. This is kind of what I was waiting for out of Greg Joseph, but it's finally kicking in, I guess. I guess it took Justin Jefferson being gone for them to not score a touchdown every drive or whatever the case may be. But it seems Justin Jefferson being gone is a good sign for Greg Joseph, at least, for what that's worth for Scrambled and Wiggle who's still going to find a way to lose by 84 every single game. Um, then Scrambled and Wiggle also had Javon Hargrave, defensive tackle for the 49ers. Um, Javon Hargrave went out there and had about 11 points, had an okay week. He had 4 tackles solo. I believe he also had a tackle for loss. Yeah, he had a tackle for loss. Um, yeah, it's a pretty okay week. This is what you hope to see out of your defensive linemen on those weeks where they can't pull off a sack, on those weeks where they can't get to the quarterback, whatever, make huge plays. At least get enough tackles to have a solid week to where you're not getting stuck with zero. Because that's the problem you'll see with, say, held Javon Hargrave week 2. You see it with defensive linemen time and time again. There's only like 1 or 2 exceptions, such as like Max Crosby, where your defensive lineman is going to have those off weeks where they just put up nothing, and your goal is to get a defensive lineman that's going to have as few of those as possible while also having the upside. And Javon Hargrave has done a solid job of that so far throughout the year. He had the bad week too. At least he had a few tackles against Dallas. But other than that, he's been pretty solid and consistent for the most part. But at least he had the tackle for loss. He had a few tackles solo to salvage the night. So can't really complain. Next up, we'll look at Pussy, who had Daniil Hunter. Daniil Hunter, this was probably the worst matchup he'll have all season, and he still was able to get a sack, which is very, very lucky on the hands of Pussy. Granted, he was going to beat Evan either way, but uh, Hunter still managed to pull off a sack. He's having one of the best seasons, if not the best season of his career. Um, I think it actually is the best season thinking about it, but at least as of now, he definitely got that. He got that sack off, which really clutched up his night. Um, this was one of the toughest matchups he'll have all season because he was going up against a pretty good right tackle. Um, on top of that, the Niners are known for doing power runs to the left because Trent Williams is the best tackle in the entire league. So yeah, the Niners' offensive line in general was just really good, but they have an insanely good left tackle, so they usually run off the edge on him a lot with Christian McCaffrey and just design the game plan around it. So a lot of the times, Daniil Hunter, when it comes to stopping runs, won't really get much attention. At least or outside linebackers or left ends won't get a lot of attention playing against the Niners. And they're pretty much entirely sack reliant. And Daniil Hunter actually managed to get a play where he beat the right tackle. I think his name is Mike McGlinchey, if I'm not pronouncing that wrong. But at least he had the sack, which salvaged his night. If you're Pussy for the rest of the season, I'm honestly, if you're Pussy, here's my advice for you. I would say only use Daniil Hunter if you think you have to win a game, because I think there's going to be times where you're going to be in close games, and if you try to take your shot with Daniil Hunter, he'll fuck you over. In the sense of he might only get 10 points compared to that to some of these other linebackers that you might have that could get like say 15 to 20 consistent points on a week to week basis. Now, if he's playing, say, the fucking Raiders, yeah, go start Daniil Hunter. He's probably gonna have like 18 sacks, but either way, um, he's definitely not a bad player. But the fact that he's considered a linebacker, you can probably settle for consistency, especially being 7-0, and especially for having a overall better roster than most of the league right now. So if you're Pussy, that's just my personal advice for you overall. But yeah, he's definitely not a bad option. Um, but if you are like in a position where you think you're probably going to lose, then yeah, take your shot with Daniil Hunter or trade him to one of those teams that have really bad linebackers, so that way they can take their shot because it would probably be an ideal player for those teams to have too. Pussy also had Nick Bosa, who, because he was playing against a white quarterback, decided not to play football. No, I'm joking. He actually did play football, but he didn't really do much outside of the tackles. At least he did have tackles. He had a tackle for loss. He had 5 total tackles. Like I said, it's great that he's getting the tackles to at least salvage the nights where he's not getting sacks. In terms of the sacks, he's really not doing that great this season. I think he has a total of, what, 2.5, 3? Um, yeah, he's really not doing that great this season in terms of the sacks, which is definitely disappointing for Nick Bosa's standards. But for what it's worth, he's still going to be one of the most consistent defensive linemen in the league. I don't think Pussy's going to be upset about this. It's just not what you were really hoping for, I don't think. And it's just been a disappointing season overall. Um, Next up, Pussy also had Kirk Cousins, who actually did pretty damn good given the circumstances. A very tough 49ers defense. He went out there, passed a few touchdowns. He did throw the interception, but he was able to overall get the offense out there. He got quite a few yards, 378. he was able to actually do good from a fantasy point of view, even without Justin Jefferson. Um, Now, of course, the Bears were able to just shut him down. The Bears are the goodest team in the league, but no, not really. Kirk Cousins just had a pretty good night. Jordan Addison went out there and cooked up, as we'll get to whenever we get to big yawners. Um, and also T.J. Hawkinson had a pretty good night. So overall, they were able to at least make the offense function in terms of fantasy and feed the ball to everyone. Um, so overall, Kirk Cousins is you're happy about that if you're pussy. It's just a matter of how much you trust Kirk Cousins. I will say I've noticed, at least with Jefferson being on, granted this is only a 2 game sample size now, um, where they played against Chicago. Chicago has a really good corner, one that did really good against Jordan Addison for most of the game when he was covering him. San Fran isn't known for having a great coverage corner. They're known for having a bunch of zone coverage corners and having big playmakers like Demondre Lenore, if I'm not pronouncing that dude's name wrong. Charvarius Ward. They're not known for their man coverage, and the problem is guys like Jordan Addison, for example, start cooking up on them a lot of the times when they try that. Um, but with the Bears, that didn't really work because they had tight man coverage on Addison, and it caused Kirk Cousins to struggle for most of the day. I will warn you if you're pussy. You're going against the Packers, who have Jair Alexander, who's arguably the best man coverage player in the entire league. He's comparable to Jalen Ramsey, Sauce Gardner. He's definitely at least in the top 5 conversation without a doubt. So I will warn you if you're pussy. I am not expecting a good week out of Kirk Cousins next week, but that's just off of the 2 game sample size we've had so far and what I've watched. But I could be wrong on that. That might be part of my start bench recommendations as we go into the next week. And then you also had Josh Metellus. I think his name's Josh. Yeah, it's Josh. He had 7 points. He did okay. He hasn't been he didn't do nearly as consistent as he did in the first few weeks, but he still got a total of 5 tackles. Now, is he am I going to tell you to go start him? No, not yet. But for what it's worth, he is still going out there and getting around 5+ tackles per game. So it's overall continuing towards the right direction, even if he didn't get that many fantasy points. You'd hope for a little more, but for what it's worth, you got to steal off a free agency here that a lot of teams would probably appreciate to have. Well, maybe not. There's a shit ton of really good defensive backs in the league, but either way, I wouldn't be concerned about this. Next up, we'll take a look at big yawners against J-Bay. Um, we'll kick things off with big yawners here. Big yawners had Jordan Addison, who we just kind of quickly talked about, but he did insanely good against the Niners, where he just cooked up over those corners. 7 catches, 123 yards, 2 receiving touchdowns. The dude's playing fucking Football Fusion from Roblox, I'm convinced. But yeah, the dude just did insane. He went out there and bullied everybody who covered him. Kirk Cousins was gunslinging to him. You name it, this is as perfect of a night. I told you guys a few times in the earlier videos, I think this guy is the next T. Higgins in the sense of, yeah, Justin Jefferson's going to be getting most of the targets and he'll be the wide receiver 1. But in terms of fantasy, this guy is pretty much going to be a borderline wide receiver 1 as well a lot of the times, especially if Justin Jefferson ever goes down. It can only get better. Now, maybe in the upcoming years, if Kirk Cousins, say, retires or something like that and they don't have a good quarterback, maybe that changes. But for now, I do think this is basically the next T. Higgins compared to Jamar Chase. That's pretty much the best way I can describe it. He's looking pretty good. Um, and yeah, Big Yawners is definitely looking happy. It's basically the next Puka Nakua and Cooper Cup. Then Big Yawners also had Diamondre Lenore, as I just were talking about with Pussy. Um, if I'm Big Yawners, depending on the matchup, I really don't like Demondre Lenore just because of his lack of consistency. He has the upside because he is a big playmaker where they pretty much scheme their defense around making mistakes from the quarterback or out of capitalizing on mistakes from the quarterback and the run game and all that. Um, that's what the Niners do is they try to stop the run and they try to stop quarterbacks, and try to shut them down with their mistakes. That's why they're so good against teams like, say, the Cowboys, say the Giants, teams like that. When they play against teams that don't make a lot of mistakes, like, say, Kirk Cousins did last night, where there aren't many picks going around or fumbles going around, that's when they'll start to struggle. Um, and yeah, that's the same story with Demondre Lenore. I don't even know how you pronounce this dude's name, but either way, Diamordor Lenore. Um, he's definitely a good player in real life, but that consistency factor is just probably not going to be there in fantasy. There's probably better options out there, to be honest, if I'm Big Yawners. Um, Then you also had Fred Warner. This is a guy, there's definitely not better options out there than. This is definitely looking like one of the best options in fantasy. He had that bad week 3, but last night went out there, had fucking 13 tackles. This is as good as you'll ever see. He had a pass deflect, he had a tackle for loss. He's going out there, he's doing everything throughout the season. He's had sacks, he's had interceptions. This guy is fantastic. There's no other linebacker in the league that I would say that this guy can't outscore on a week to week basis, even Roquan Smith. Um, Am I saying I'd rather have him over Roquan Smith? No, but he definitely has the upside to do better than him literally every single week. And hell, I think he actually is outscoring Roquan Smith as we speak so far throughout the season. But yeah, he's looking fantastic there. That's for sure. There's no debate for me. This was an absolute steal for where Big Yawners got him. Next up, we'll take a look at Mr. Steeler Girl. Mr. Steeler Girl had Brock Purdy, who did not play good at all. Um, yeah, these past 2 weeks for Purdy have been pretty ugly. Yeah, he had 272 passing yards for what it's worth, but yeah, the turnovers kept killing him. He threw 2 interceptions, passed 1 touchdown, had a few rushing yards, 19 rushing yards, but yeah, Purdy is really starting to struggle on this offense. You're starting to see flashes of why he's Mr. Irrelevant. Now, to his credit, it was just 2 mistakes. He did play pretty solid for most of the night outside of those 2 mistakes, but the 2 passes that he threw that were interceptions were ugly. They weren't just like wrong reads or anything like that. They were bad. Like he was throwing that shit pretty much right to the defender on both of them. Um, yeah, it didn't really look too good. I'm gonna be honest. So I'm a little concerned about Purdy, but he was showing flashes of being pretty fucking bad, like Mitch Trubisky level of flashes. But we'll have to see as the season goes on. Maybe he's able to pick up the consistency like he pretty much did throughout the whole season so far, outside of these last 2 weeks. But if you're Mr. Steeler Girl, watching the rest of your team start to get better and watching your quarterback start to just fall off after all this season, it's definitely a bit demoralizing. But overall, maybe he can keep picking things up in the upcoming weeks. Good luck to Mr. Steeler, though. Um, you also had Tyler Noah Hufunga. It's kind of funny. Mr. Steeler Girl's whole team is flipping because you remember how in the past videos I said Tyler Noah Hufunga's droppable at this point. Well, he started to pick things up over the past 2 weeks. He had 9 tackles. This is the thing. Hufunga was pretty much credited to be the next Troy Polamalu, where he could make big plays left and right all around the board. Um, and he was just kind of getting shut down in terms of getting tackles and in terms of the consistency. These past 2 weeks, he has gotten 7 and 9 tackles total. He's making the big plays, or not big plays happen. He's making the consistency happen whenever he's not able to make the big plays. Um, so he is looking pretty good. Again, am I going to say he's still trustworthy? No, not yet. I'd need to see a few more weeks out of him before I could say that, just because, like, all season he's been all over the place with his points. But he definitely does have the upside, though. I'll give Mr. Steeler Girl that. Last night, he did pretty damn solid. This is kind of what I was expecting at the beginning of the season. Um, but maybe he's able to continue it. We just got to wait and see. And then Mr. Steeler Girl also had Harrison Smith, who went out there and had a pretty solid night. Harrison Smith, I will say he's a bit inflated in terms of his points just because of that 1 week, but he's not a bad option overall. He's been pretty consistent all year. To at least get 7 to 10 points on a week to week basis, even when he doesn't have really good games. But he always has the upside to do better. He's had around 6 tackles in every game. He had the 1 week where he had 4, but for the most part, he's had a lot of tackles. He's forcing fumbles a lot. That's what he's known for, is his hard hitting. He had a pass deflect. He's pretty much all over the place. This is what Harrison Smith's known for. He had a pretty solid night. You're pretty happy with that if you're Mr. Steeler Girl with him moving forward. I do think there's better options out there, but I don't think he's bad, though. I'm not going to say to necessarily cut him. But yeah, I definitely do think he's pretty good. Then Booty had Christian McCaffrey. He actually didn't start him. He played him on his bench because nobody knew who the hell was going to play. And the answer was Christian McCaffrey, who went out there and had another Christian McCaffrey night. He only had 3 yards per carry. That's a little concerning because the Vikings defense really isn't that good. But he did have a touchdown. He did have 3 catches for 51 yards and another touchdown. So for what it's worth, that pretty much salvaged his night. He did bad in terms of the yards per carry. Maybe it's because he was playing through that injury. That's entirely possible as to why. So maybe it's not that much of a concern just because he was playing through that injury, like I said. He did get the 2 touchdowns, did insanely good on the receiving part of things. And I guess we'll have to wait and see how healthy he is in the upcoming weeks. But other than that, Booty's still looking happy with him. This is arguably, if not undisputedly, the number one pick you could have had in the first round for all of fantasy, pretty much. This dude's doing insane so far. Let's get into the actual football side of things here. The final score was 22-17 between these two teams. It was a very defensive scoring game, or not defensive scoring game, a very defensive sided game for the most part. In the sense of the Niners pretty much, the Niners were trying to cause turnovers, and the Vikings. I don't even know what the fuck I'm saying. I'm sorry, guys. But anyway, uh, both teams here were doing very good in terms of the defensive side of things, where it was a game where they were trying to force each other to make mistakes, and the Niners ended up making a lot more offensive mistakes, while the Vikings, even though they didn't really do perfect on offense, they punted quite a few times, to be honest, but either way, they definitely made less mistakes overall, and that's what won them the game. That's kind of what I was trying to say, but I kind of fucked up my wording. But either way, Brock Purdy went out there and just, yeah, he played pretty ugly for some of those throws, like I said. For the most part, his accuracy was on point. He was making some big plays where he had a touchdown. He had quite a few passing yards per attempt. But yeah, the few plays he was ugly though. I can't there's no way around it. Um then there was Christian McCaffrey who went out there and had 3 yards per carry, which is a little concerning, like I said, but maybe he's able to do better as the weeks go on. And hell, if he's getting 2 touchdowns per game, it doesn't matter. But in terms of real life, he didn't do as good as you'd expect. George Kittle went out there, was the number one receiver for the Niners. To Brock Purdy's credit, he was spreading the ball around pretty well. There was 5 catches for 78 yards for Kittle, 5 for 57 for Ayuk, 5 catches for 54 yards for Jawan Jennings. Plus, he actually called that one. But yeah, Jawan Jennings is looking like he's pretty solid whenever Debo Samuel or Brandon Ayuk are out. He's the guy that usually goes in there as the wide receiver 3, and he's actually looked pretty solid. McCaffrey had the 3 catches for 51 yards and a touchdown. Ray McLeod had 2 catches for 20 yards. I actually forgot to mention him on Milf's team. I don't know if Milf cut him or if he still has him, but um, either way, he really didn't do too much, so I didn't think it was worth mentioning much out of anyway. Um, Dre Greenlaw was insane with the tackling. So is Fred Warner and Talanoa Hufanga. 3 guys that just made all sorts of tackles. The technical main tackler was Fred Warner. But yeah, all 3 of those guys had insane nights, did really good around the board. All of them are fantasy relevant at this point. Nick Bosa had quite a few tackles to salvage his night. Charvarius Ward actually had the interception. That was the one mistake that the Vikings made where Kirk Cousins threw the pick. Um, Other than that, I don't think they had any sacks or anything that were worth mentioning. Like I said, Hargrave had a few tackles. Lenore had a few tackles, but not as good as you would want in terms of fantasy, though. Um, but overall, this loss definitely isn't on the Niners' defense. They did their job overall, but the offense definitely just did horrible and kind of put too much on their plate, if that makes sense. Um, but overall, there also was a missed kick by Jake Booty, but we didn't really get a chance to talk about that because Booty actually dropped him over this last week. Um, but overall, that's about it in terms of the Niners. Then the Vikings had Kirk Cousins, who had almost a perfect night. That's almost as good as you can get. Now, I know he did miss 10 passes, but when you throw 45, you're going to miss some. It's going to happen. He had the interception, which was, that wasn't great. But other than that, Kirk Cousins went out there and had about as good of a night as you could ever ask of him. Maybe a bit more touchdowns could have made it better, but almost 400 yards, 2 touchdowns, you're going to take it. Alex Madison had 8 carries for 39 yards. He did pretty solid. I guess he's trying to keep his job. Cam Akers had actually more rushing attempts than him, but got less yards, so that's a good sign for Alex Madison, but it's not promising anything just because Cam Akers is starting to take more of the workload, but at least Madison did more with it, so that might make the Vikings backtrack a little bit and give him more opportunities. Jordan Addison, this was the Jordan Addison show. Hawkinson went out there and did fantastic. Don't get me wrong in the slightest. I just realized too, I actually forgot to mention Rick Tatership's team on this list. But yeah, Rick Tatership had Cameron Bynum and T.J. Hawkinson. But either way, T.J. Hawkinson did pretty damn good. He had 11 catches for 86 yards. We already talked about Addison for the most part, so I'll kind of skim over him. TJ Hawkinson had 11 catches, 86 yards. He did fucking great. One of the better nights you're going to get out of Hawkinson in all of fantasy. I don't think he's going to be able to consistently do that, but it's definitely a really good night. Um, then Brandon Powell actually had 4 catches for 64 yards. KJ Osborne had the 5 catches for 47. Like I said, this ball, as well as the Niners, both teams are pretty much getting the ball everywhere or sending the ball everywhere, just trying to do something to move the offense. Because yeah, it was a very defensive game, like I already said. So both teams were trying to pretty much just spread the ball around, do whatever they could to get something to work. And then like I said, I completely forgot to mention Dictatorship's team, but he had Cameron Bynum, who had the fucking 9 total tackles and 2 interceptions. Cameron Bynum did insane. For a reference in fantasy, that was definitely over 20 points. He's been, or I think it's undisputedly the number one safety in all of fantasy so far. Maybe Dax Hill, but I believe Cameron Bynum is the number one safety as of yet, and I think that only contributed to it. Um, Jordan Hicks had a pretty solid night. Other than that, from a fantasy side of things, you had a sack from Danielle Hunter, which salvaged his night. Other than that, from the fantasy side of things, there wasn't really much worth mentioning. I don't think out of the Vikings team here. Greg Joseph did miss a field goal. I forgot to mention too. But other than that, I don't really think there was actually too much worth mentioning though. That would actually help you guys in fantasy. That it was pretty much just a defensive showdown where people were just trying to fight for whatever yards they could. And then the team that made less mistakes is the team that won, and that was the Vikings here, like I keep saying. Um, Either way, that's the video. I hope you guys enjoyed. Um, I'll try to get you guys the defensive back rating rankings video with Pussy later on. I might not be able to make the matchup of the week until tomorrow. I don't know for sure. I'll have to see. But either way, I'll send you guys the video if it comes out. Have a very good one, and I'll see you then.